and welcome back to Cinematic Sarcastic, the podcast that talks all things movies and television. I'm Natalie, and I'm your host. On this episode, we are going to be talking about the Sandman. I did take some time and went back and forth a little bit on whether or not I was going to move forward with doing a review of the Sandman, and I'll try and keep this as short as I possibly can while still being as honest as I possibly can about kind of where I'm coming from with the show and how I felt about it. So I will start off by just being pretty honest with all of the listeners out there that take the time to go through my reviews and listen to them. I will say that though I am familiar with some of the characters from the Sandman comics, like Constantine, the Fates, I'm familiar with Neil Gaiman's, other stories and works, but I'm not particularly familiar with the Sandman comics specifically. So I'm not familiar with the storyline for the Sandman comics or anything like that. Pretty much the majority of what I have seen as far as like some of the characters from the Sandman would be like the Keanu Reeves movie of Constantine, and of course the show Lucifer that starred Lucifer Morningstar. But beyond that, I haven't really dove in, if that's a word, dived into the Sandman comics. So I've seen art more so than actually like storyline. So I wasn't sure if I wanted to review the Sandman because I think really at the very core of this series, I don't know that I am the best, most qualified person to give a review. Like, I understand with some shows and movies, everyone is kind of going in on equal footing and very, for instance, like with Bullet Train, I was not familiar with that book, but I feel like it was something that was easier to step into. The Sandman, I would say, is a bit more complex. It did take me some time to work through this season because I don't think that this series has been altered in a way that makes it super easy for those out there like myself who aren't familiar with the content to just kind of dive in and understand what's going on. I had seen another review before I had even started watching The Sandman. There was a review that dropped pretty much the same day that The Sandman show dropped online, and this person had mentioned that they found The Sandman to be incredibly boring. And I will say, I think I kind of understand maybe where that reviewer was coming from, but I don't agree with the word that he chose for it. I think to call The Sandman boring is really kind of just picking the easiest way to say that you were not interested in paying attention to the story, because nothing about the Sandman series was boring to me. What I will say is I think the Sandman is not the television series for someone that wants to be able to just sit back for an hour, at a night, let's say, if you're just not going to binge the whole thing, and get up and get snacks, go to the bathroom, check your phone a couple of times. I don't think the Sandman series is for you if you're that kind of television watcher. If you're familiar with the comics, I feel like that maybe is totally fine. But if you're a newbie to the Sandman, you really have to invest in this one, or at least I had to invest in it. There is so much, so much story in the Sandman series that I don't think the word boring was accurate. I feel the word overwhelming is more on par with what the Sandman series is for those people out there like myself who are not familiar with it. This is a show that I feel like I will have to watch multiple times to be able to understand the intricacies of the characters and the stories and how things tied together. one thing I will say, which I understand, I am obviously not the one that is coming at a show and have any ability to change how a show is written. And again, I'm coming from a space of not really understanding the comics, but I really would have loved to have seen the Sandman broken out into the separate stories, like a season for each story. And I don't know if that ruins like the continuity of the comics or how the story is told, but I feel like there are so many interwoven stories in the Sandman that at times it is sort of difficult to keep up with all of them. I know I had essentially like a phone a friend. I have a friend who is very familiar with the Sandman comics and really, really loves them. And I must have texted him almost every single episode to ask, who is this character and what am I missing here? And how how is this thing happening? And explain this little detail to me because I feel like I'm missing something. Like he sort of was my Sandman dictionary, if you will, helping me to understand and make it through this series. And I wouldn't say that the Sandman is bad in any way, shape, or form. It is the most stunning television show that I have ever seen. I think I had mentioned to my friend that my favorite part of the series were the doors to the different realms, like the doors that go into the dreaming, or for instance, the big doors that go into hell are the most intricate, like gorgeous pieces of set design that I have ever seen. I could just stand in front of the doors to the dreaming and look at all of the little details, and his mask being on the door, to the gate into the dreaming. I found that incredibly awesome to look at. And just like the dreaming in and of itself and the different aspects to that world, so to speak, are incredible. And the one thing that I can say about the Sandman from somebody who is kind of outside of the realm of that, I think that the Sandman is a very beautiful, beautiful love letter to everyone that loves the comics. I mean, it has to be. Like, everything is just so intricate and so wonderful. And I was a little bit concerned, I will say. Maybe concerned isn't the right word, but I went into it not sure about the casting choices, specifically for Lucifer, with Gwendolyn Christie taking over the role of Lucifer Morningstar, because I was coming into it only having seen Lucifer Morningstar in the television series, who's played by someone completely different and a man. And I wasn't sure if that role being now played by a woman was going to change the character much, but I will say, like, Gwendolyn Christie and her depiction of Lucifer was just, it was amazing. It was a strange sort of experience for me going into, because watching her play Lucifer, I felt like the character itself, like, even though obviously it is a completely different person playing it, I feel like they both nailed it, but in their own styles, if that makes sense. And her interaction, like the interaction between Lucifer and Dream when he first goes in to try and get his mask, I believe, back from one of Lucifer's demons, the interaction between the two of them was probably my favorite sequence of anything through the entire series. And I will say, like, Dream interacting with his family, so to speak, or the other Endless in the show, were by far and away my favorite parts of the show. And it did make me a little bit sad that you didn't really get to see him interact with them much. There was a lot going on, which is why I will say I had wished that they had been able to break it apart in a way that maybe could have stretched the story a little bit further out. And I don't know if the fans of the Sandman out there are like booing me and saying, no, it's perfect the way it is because this is how the comics are. And if that is the case, then, I'm not super familiar with it. But I think that I would have loved to have seen this story maybe told over more time, specifically because for me, it was a lot to take in, and it was pretty difficult to really understand a lot of what was going on. I mean, the first episode itself is an hour long, and in that hour it contains 100 years, 100 human years, and then 3 generations of people. And that's a lot to kind of understand what's going on and who these characters are. And then each episode introduced you to just more characters and more story and more, more twists and turns of the Sandman's journey. And I will say, I think that's kind of where I understand, where that first reviewer was coming from when he said it was boring, because I think if you are not willing to invest in the Sandman, you are probably not going to get very much out of it. If you are not willing to sit and try and understand the story and really kind of Google if you have to, because I did that quite a bit, it probably will be boring, because there's so much happening that if you're not paying attention, you're probably going to miss something that matters in the overall theme of what's going on. And then, if you get lost, it's that much harder to get back into it. The acting of the majority of the people in this was phenomenal. Some of the episodes were just crazy. I will say, despite the phenomenal actors and all of the great characters, I really think that my favorite character out of everyone was the Corinthian. I mean, I understand. Pulling eyes out aside, I really enjoyed his dynamic with Dream and his dynamic with really the world and humans in general. I almost enjoyed him more than I enjoyed Dream. In a weird way, I found him more, what is the word? More human. Even though he is a nightmare, I almost found him to be more empathetic. Maybe that's the word that I'm looking for. Even though, he comes from a very selfish perspective, he's doing everything that he's doing with the intention of wanting not to have to really give up essentially his life and go back to the dreaming, so he's very self-serving throughout the whole thing. But I feel like he kind of came from a more human place than Dream does. Dream seems very cold and aloof through the majority of the series. And, so it's hard, I guess, for me to understand a lot of his motivation through the series. And I'm very excited, honestly. I hope that they continue to do the Sandman. I really want to see more interactions between Dream and the other Endless. And I will be sad not to see the Corinthian in future seasons, but I really do want to see kind of how Dream evolves over time and if he becomes a little bit more human, because one of my favorite sequences, tiny spoiler, I gave away a little spoiler with the Corinthian as well, apologies, but tiny spoiler, Fiddler's Green was one of my favorite characters in this one as well. And Fiddler's Green brought up a very wonderful point, I felt like, towards the end of the series, that he mentions to Dream, he had left, Fiddler's Green did, and lived kind of a human life. And he was like, it makes me understand things differently. And I think if Dream would attempt to understand human beings more, you might understand how to interact with them better. It might make you feel something. And so that kind of perked me up a little bit in hopes that maybe we'll get to see some of that come out of Dream in later seasons if the series does continue. But I think that you can absolutely see just the work that went into Sandman overall and how much effort went into trying to make the comics as lifelike as possible. And I know, Neil Gaiman worked side by side with them the whole way to really bring it to life. And I think it shows. And it's no surprise to me that the series has such great reviews because it has a really great fan base. And I think this really was made specifically for that fan base. So coming from outside of that is a little bit more difficult to get into, but I think well worth the effort of really putting it into that and trying to get something out of it. And some of the underlying messages are really great. yeah, so I'm not sure exactly where else to go with that, but let me know what you guys thought of Sandman if you have had the chance to watch it. Subscribe if you want to join the Movie Nerd family, and I hope to see you in the next episode.